Let's bring in three guests to talk about this. In the studio with me are Leila Nasr, the Communications Coordinator for the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Ihsaan Gardee is the Executive Director of the same organization, and Hassan Yussuff is the President of the Canadian Labour Congress. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming in to talk to me about this important topic. And I want to get to the report and recommendations in a moment, but I want to start by getting a sense of you of where you think the Muslim community is at right now in this country, given the events we saw in New Zealand with the murder of 50 Muslims there. And I ask it in the sense of how the community here is dealing and responding to that, and what Canadians can do to help with that situation in this country. Who would like to start?
Sure. I mean, I think at the moment there's this palpable sense of grief still. You know, the attack in New Zealand really brought back home what happened next door in Quebec. And to know that they were sort of both attacks fueled by the same kinds of hatred, white supremacy, intolerance as each other, it really signals just how much we have to do, not just as a country, but as an international community as well. You know, hate breeds hate all over the world, and certainly we've got our work cut out for us.
Ihsaan, what are your thoughts?
I think that, you know, I'll echo what Leila has said, that there's been a mix of emotions, grief, fear, certainly anxiety from within the Muslim community about their sense of security and safety and inclusion, some anger as well. But what I would say is what I've been saying in other interviews is that, you know, while this came as a surprise, it didn't come as a shock, unfortunately. We've seen this coming, and we've seen it here in Canada. And these kinds of events, they don't happen in a vacuum. As Leila mentioned, there's been the rise of far-right groups. We've had the rise of online hate as well, proliferating sort of unfettered through our online platforms. You know, we've seen it sort of manifest in other places as well, from our political leadership employing language and rhetoric that targets and vilifies particular minorities, and other places as well.
I want to get into some of that in our conversation, but Mr. Yussuff, let me get your response to what we've seen in New Zealand, and I guess what it calls on all of us. I'm not Muslim. What does it call on all of us in this country to do in the face of these kinds of atrocities?
Well, you know, we as Canadians have always been very generous, because we've come from very many different walks of life, from many different cultures and history. And the strength of this country has always been resilient, as how we have been able to forge that sense of identity, that we're one people, we can embrace all of these differences and still build a great country. And at this particular moment, recognizing the Muslim community is feeling a lot of fear, there's anxiety, there's worries, and especially around children. I think what individuals can do is to reach out to their neighbor or friends and say, hey, we're here, we're going to work together, and employers can say, we're not going to tolerate this in our workplace. But more importantly, I think our politicians have to be much more forceful. I saw the Prime Minister's statement this week in the House was very strong, condemning this, but also said we're not going to tolerate it. And I think we need to see more of our elected officials, both federally, provincially, and municipally, say, we're not going to accept this any form or shape in our community or any part of our country. If we do that, I think those who are trying to perpetuate it know they've got no place to hide. They're going to be challenged, they're going to be taken on.
Okay, let's talk. The report today specifically talks about, I mean, you can't talk about Islamophobia in the workplace without talking about the broader issue. I mean, the workplace but this was the focus of the report today. But Leila, let me start with you. How big of an issue is this? I mean, at your news conference this morning, you talked about a number of examples. How big of an issue is this for Muslim Canadians in the workplace in this country?
I mean, I think the general sentiment is that there's, especially after attacks like what happened in Christchurch, there's this fear, not that just penetrates your everyday kind of life in the street. Maybe a woman who, as a visible hijabi woman, perhaps is worried about being attacked in the street or something, and certainly that fear is real, but it's also those microaggressions, those unexceptional moments in the workplace where you know, negative behaviors, negative rhetoric about difference, and you know, divisive rhetoric about Muslims and people of other racialized minorities as well are festering. And I mean, this report today really highlights the extent of those challenges and the way that they play out in things like hiring, firing, promotion. It really infiltrates every aspect of the workplace.
I think, I mean, a lot of people would be surprised to find, because we've talked about you know, religious freedoms and workplace issues for some time in this country, that you know, the right to be able to practice your religion in the workplace, but some of the examples we've heard about how that's not always the case. What does that say about the need, and it's addressed in the report, Ihsaan, about the need to, you know, and I'm not sure it's it's as much as sensitizing employers in the workplace, but some people would say, look, the sensitizing has been happening. It's been cracking down on workers in the workplace, employers in the workplace about the rights of the people that work for them.
No, I think that's an incredibly important point, is educating employers as well as employees about what are their rights in the workplace and what are the employer's responsibilities to their employees when it comes to things like religious accommodations.
But you're talking about education, and the example you gave this morning, and I was watching, it's educating's one thing, but the case you gave, there's an employer saying, I don't care about your rights and I don't care about your religion, go back to your job. That would suggest there might be a wall in some places in trying to educate people, right?
Yeah, no, certainly there does appear, and I can tell you consistently in the casework that NCCM handles when we get cases reported to us, many of the times we are able to resolve those cases because a lot of it may be based on a lack of awareness about what their obligations are under human rights codes, etc. And assuming you have two parties that come to the table in good faith, you're usually able to come to some resolution that can accommodate both the person's request and still ensure that the employer isn't experiencing undue hardship. That said, Peter, I wanted to also say that what NCCM has noted is that there's a consistent pattern of spikes in Islamophobia. And over the years, whenever Islam or Muslims are in the media spotlight in a negative way, our organization has consistently noticed a spike in the number of reports that we see and hear about. After the shootings in Quebec City, the month after, they had the highest number of hate crimes reported in Quebec alone. So this speaks as well to, you know, the power of the media as well in terms of reporting on these issues. There was a recent study from the University of Alabama that came out and said that when we're looking at attacks perpetrated by people who identify as Muslims, there's 357% more coverage of those attacks than when they're perpetrated by non-Muslims. 105 headlines versus 15 headlines. And that reinforces the rhetoric of those on the right and white supremacists, etc., to be able to say, see, it is the Muslims and they're the ones who have a sole franchise on this.
What's the biggest in the recommendation, the number of recommendations in your report today, but what's the message to government here? I mean, you've got messages for trade unions, and that's one thing, but you know, I mean, there are certain workplace laws in the federal regime that maybe aren't the same in other workplaces, but what's the message to the federal government here?
Well, I think as anytime we face challenges of this magnitude that affect the whole country, the federal government always have a responsibility to how they can work with the territories and the province to come together, is to forge a common approach, because we don't have a common approach to how do we deal with this across the country. That is uniquely a role that the federal government can do in terms of bringing those ministers together to talk about how do we take this on. Because no matter where you work in Canada, you have the same rights, by the way. All human rights codes across the country provide for the same protection for Canadians, whether you work federal jurisdiction, provincial, territorial jurisdiction. So the laws are consistent. The fundamental problem, of course, the weakness in enforcing the laws and making sure employer understand this obligation is on you and nobody else. Now, we take the position that it's better when we work together, both as employer, as unions, we can address these concerns, because if our members are perpetuating something that we know are fundamentally wrong to our values, how do we work with you as the employer to ensure they understand if you do this, you're going to get yourself in trouble? So before you get yourself in trouble, how can we prevent it from happening? Secondly, of course, to be proactive. If you have a diverse workforce, it's important to recognize they have different needs. The needs are not going to be the same. So you need to ensure your supervisor, in the case that Leila took this morning, the supervisor know, excuse me, you have responsibility as a supervisor on behalf of us as the management. Right. So you better make sure you conduct yourself in a way that's consistent with our obligations. And secondly, of course, you got to lead by example. There's nothing more important for the leader of our organization to put themselves in the forefront and say, I'm not just saying you have these rights in the workplace. As the president of the company or the CEO, I'm going to make sure we're going to guarantee you're going to live and work in this workplace.
We're going to encourage those rights.
Absolutely.
We're going to make you feel like you're welcome, not just that we have to give you something, even though we don't really want to.
Yeah.
Let me finish on a couple of things, and that was the issue around, there's been lots of discussion around the streaming of this attack in New Zealand and the responsibility of social media companies to deal with this. Ihsaan, let me start with, are they doing enough?
I don't think they're doing enough, and I think that's a sentiment that's been echoed by many that I've spoken to, including people in government, that the algorithms exist for these social media companies and these tech companies to be able to pick up and detect these kinds of content that are posted online, and to be able to intercept them or at least pull them down much, much more quickly than they did in this case. And there have to be measures as well that government take to ensure that the social media companies are complying, whether that's sanctioned through fines or other ways of sanctioning. I think we need to be looking at what are the best practices happening in other parts of the world. In Germany, they have a model where if a social media company posts something that's hateful, they have 24 hours to take it down or they're subject to heavy fines. Now, that model has received praise as well as some criticism for having a bit of vagueness in their definitions, etc. So I think it's important at the same time to recognize that Canadians, are concerned around free expression, and we want to make sure that we are vigorously defending that.
That's where I'm going next. What about the argument that in taking measures to try and prevent Islamophobia, you end up curtailing the right to free speech? Leila, what about that argument?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that's prominent in our discourse at the moment. But, it's so important to understand that it's a fine line, but it is a line. And our laws account for that as well. I don't have the right to go into a workplace and openly spew intolerance and hate speech about someone or some group. We spoke about it a little bit more this morning. Yeah, it is a fine line.
Yeah, it's a fine line, but it's and some people think that some of these measures will go beyond that fine line. What's the response to that?
Well, listen, our Constitution and our values didn't evolve simply out of nowhere. It evolved over the history of us learning from experience the things that we haven't done right in this country. We recognize that the hate that Muslims are dealing with right now is having a huge impact on people to participate in this democracy. And while you have a right to free speech, you do not have a right to perpetuate hate in a society. And the laws are very clear, and we need to hold those accountable. This is not somebody saying, listen, I disagree with the Muslim religion. That's fair comment. I accept that reality. But the reality is, if I work in a workplace, you don't have a right to treat me because workplace laws take precedence. Similarly, in the broader society, as citizens and as neighbors and as friends, somebody is my neighbor spewing hate, I can speak up against that. I don't need permission from a politician or from the laws of this country. Excuse me, what you're doing is simply wrong. That's against the value of our neighborhood, and it's against my friendship of my colleague here. I think there are things we can do, and of course, at the same time recognizing, yes, we want to uphold our fundamental right to free speech, but free speech does not mean you take away the right of people to live in a society free of fear. And I think that's what it does for the Muslim community and the children of the Muslim community.
We'll have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you all for coming in to speak with me. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.